I'm going to try and survive 100 days in Conan Exiles while also trying to defeat every boss to hopefully escape this Dark Souls survival game. My journey through the exiled lands started in the desert, with nothing but a goal to conquer the world that had left me for dead. I traveled north to start this epic quest ahead of me. In order to survive this harsh world, I would need to level up. The best way for me to do that was by killing all of the enemies along this river. I spent my entire day obliterating the populations of crocodiles, hyenas, and kappas. At the end of my first day, I set up a camp for the night to rest as the journey ahead of me would be long. At the start of my second day, I headed into Shellback Hollow, where I discovered the Tome of Kurok. This book would help me upgrade my sorcery skills later on. After acquiring the tome, I traveled west, near the city of the Relic Hunters. Here, I'm going to set my base up after gathering more resources. But for the time being, I'll have to sleep on the ground for another night. After gathering so many resources on the previous day, I decided to relax on day 3 with a bit of base building. Now I won't lie, I'm not a base builder. Normally I go for the efficient box design, but for this, I wanted to try something a little different. So I went with more of a circular base design, and I think it came out pretty great. After my base was finished, I worked all night gathering more resources for the next day. My fourth day was fairly short, as I spent it furnishing my base with workbenches like the blacksmith, armorer, and carpenter's bench. After acquiring all of the iron from my previous days, I decided to craft iron tools and weapons. I then crafted myself some light armor for protection and to get out of these crusty rags. With all of my new gear, I began roaming this oasis to level up and learn the lay of the land. While exploring, I came across this massive bug creature. Feeling fairly confident in my new equipment and fighting skills, I decided to attack this worthy foe. After an intense battle of dodging poisonous attacks, I emerged victorious. I was able to find a key on its body and unlocked a nearby chest that held a legendary set of daggers. Using these newly acquired daggers and riding the high of defeating a creature that strong, I found another worthy opponent called the King Kappa. Now these daggers cause a bleeding effect to enemies, so I made quick work of the king. Yes, another day, which meant more resource farming, which is exactly the only thing I did for all of day 6. For my 7th day, I traveled back east to a small cave called the Warren of Degenerates. It was filled with crystal, which I would need later in my journey. I then found a massive amount of iron near this tower. With all of these resources, I decided to head home. Starting on day 8, I crafted medium armor, which would provide me more protection than the light armor. I headed down towards the starting river and made my way to a cave known as the Sinner's Refuge, which held an important resource known as brimstone. However, it was also filled with enemies who I would need to dispatch first. After clearing this cave, I decided to head further east to Galaman's tomb. This cave was filled with crocodiles and a giant crocodile boss. More importantly, it was also filled with brimstone. After clearing all of the stones, I decided to fight that giant crocodile with an iron mace, which isn't a weapon I have ever used before. Luckily for me though, the mace proved to be very dependable, and I defeated this boss and acquired a jagged scourge stone piece. Now, remember this item, as it will come back later in my journey. For day 9, I used the brimstone from the caves on day 8 and tar from turning all of the hide I've acquired into leather to create steel fire. Using this steel fire with iron, I was able to craft steel, and after all of that, I was finally able to make steel tools and weapons. For day 10, I did a different type of farming. I came to this camp in the savannah to farm a specific type of enemy, the Sorcerer. Now, sorcerers drop an item called the Sorcerer's Skull. I'll explain why I was farming them on day 11, but for now, I'll just keep going. After farming Sorcerer's Skulls, I turn them in for these coins which I use to buy tools, weapons, and most importantly, material. These material boxes contain hundreds of useful items which I would need to reach the end game. For day 12, I headed south to this cave called Hanuman's Grotto. This cave holds a useful resource called glowing goop, which I would use later for sorcery. After acquiring this resource, I headed home and began upgrading my sorcery knowledge using this glowing goop. Starting on day 13, I upgraded my sorcery knowledge yet again. After a few upgrades, the corruption really started taking over my health and stamina, so I headed into the nearby city to get rid of it. Now at this tavern, there are dancers who will actually lessen or eliminate the corruption effects caused by sorcery. Also, Conan was here, but that's not important. Anyways, I headed back home and crafted some cloth pouches. These pouches would be useful for casting spells. At the end of the day, I wanted to expand my base to place larger and better workbenches, so I began deconstruction of my current build. I spent all of day 14 constructing a bigger base, and that was pretty much all I did that day. After constructing the base, I needed to furnish it, so that is exactly what I did for day 15. On day 16, I decided to fill my base with a few thralls, so I headed north, specifically looking for an alchemist to unlock more recipes at the alchemist's bench. Luckily, after searching for a few minutes, I was able to find one. I spent the rest of the day gathering more thralls, and that's pretty much all I did. Day 17 was another day for gathering thralls for the base. I managed to get this fighter known as Lian. Apparently, he was one of the best followers I could have. For the rest of the day, I gathered these thralls known as Chimerian Berserker, as they were some of the best fighters from what I could find. While traveling home from my previous adventure, I ran into this white tiger, which happened to be a boss. But luckily, I made quick work of it. Once I arrived home, I made heavy armor, which provided a unique set of bonuses like additional carrying capacity on top of the better armor. Day 19 started with me crafting both spiced tea and steak. These food items are used to increase my temperature so that I can survive longer in the frozen north. Speaking of the frozen north, I traveled here in order to acquire this resource known as black ice. This would be useful once I get back to my base. Now, the most important thing that happened on day 20 was crafting hardened steel. This resource then allowed me to craft hardened steel tools and weapons. And finally, ending the day, I crafted thick leather, which would be useful in crafting in-game armors. On day 21, I traveled back to the savannah to farm a few elephants for crafting armor. Then, going back to the same sorcerer camp, I farmed skulls for the rest of the day. Day 22 was fairly lackluster, as I cleared this camp and collected skulls from the sorcerers yet again. Day 23 came, and I turned in all of the skulls that I had been collecting, and purchased more materials with them. For day 24, I wanted to try a build I had seen previously, and I needed to focus on this overlord journey in order to do so. My 25th day was spent hunting spiders in caves. I would need their eggs for a resource known as gossamer, which I could then turn into silk, which would then further be turned into layered silk. That I would need for crafting the slaver's hood, which I had acquired from doing the overlord journey step that I mentioned on day 24. For day 26, I built a horse stable and animal pen. Horses are obviously a much faster way of traveling the map, and provide some extra storage. Luckily for me, I picked up a horse in my travels, so I was able to put him in the stables immediately. I also put some of the other animals that I've picked up along the way in this animal pen. To end the day, I crafted and placed a circle of power, which would be used for sorcery later on. On day 27, I headed to the north yet again to the volcano and gathered obsidian. Unfortunately, the obsidian wouldn't be useful for a very long time. I also collected raw ash from the obsidian, which would be necessary for crafting armor sooner rather than later. For day 28, I crafted the slaver's hood and skelos armor. Then I headed back into the city to a place called the cellar. The cellar is a dungeon, and at this start, there's a boss whose weapon is exactly what I needed to complete my build. On day 29, I've headed into the nearby city to tame more thrall. Day 30 was another day for gathering thralls, and not much else happened. Well, besides me taming these cats. Starting day 31, I headed back to the savannah once again to my normal sorcerer's farming spot. This time, I was here to acquire one of these sorcerers in order to progress my skills in sorcery. While I was waiting for my sorcerer converted, I went and fought this giant crocodile boss. It's similar to the one I fought previously, but this one holds a key to a chest that contains a legendary weapon. I also decided to fight this King Scorpion, as he was protecting yet another chest containing a legendary weapon. My 32nd day was a bit of an adventure. I traveled all the way east to Buccaneer Bay. Here I fought one of the bosses in the area and acquired a shattered scourge stone piece, yet another item you would have to remember, as it will come into play much later in the video. However, this was not the only reason I was here. Climbing the shipwreck, I was looking for this book, which had the information for Corsair armor, which was going to help me in the next few days. For day 33, I crafted the black Corsair armor, which I had acquired on the previous day. With my new armor equipped, I headed south. I found this giant spider while wandering the desert and realized this would be the ultimate test for my new gear. Luckily for me, the Corsair armor gives a bonus to agility weapons. If you combine that with my 2 javelins, which are also agility weapons, this boss became the unluckiest creature in the exiled lands. Now day 34 was fairly sad, as Leon, my follower, died while exploring a nearby cave. Now I don't want to spoil too much, but just know he died to a worthy champion. But I would be back to get my revenge. Day 35 was a fairly dark day. I built several sacrificial stones in order to progress my sorcery knowledge, because I was chasing one specific item acquired only through sorcery, which is the transpiratory stone. I needed to sacrifice enough thralls in order to use their souls to upgrade my sorcery. I know, it's pretty dark, but it's Conan. On the 36th day, I went to the unnamed city to farm these baby dragons in order to progress my sorcery to unlock the teleporting stones. I spent all of day 37 traversing the unnamed city once again in order to find these fragments of power, so that I could further upgrade my sorcery knowledge. Day 38 was an easy day, as the only thing I focused on was upgrading sorcery yet again. It's day 39, and for this entire day, I went to the silver mine at Rhino Horn Ridge and farmed these silver rock noses. They drop silver, which would be an important ingredient in making alchemical base, and it was used in a massive amount of recipes, such as weapons, armor, and alchemy. For days 40 and 41, I pretty much just gathered stone and wood and basic materials like that for the entire 2 days. So for days 42 and 43, I ventured to my most frequently visited areas, placing the few teleporters that I had built. Unfortunately, day 44 was yet another dark day for me. For this entire day, I was sacrificing soldiers in the nearby city, as I had just learned that in order to turn on every teleporter, I would need 3 sacrificial blood, which meant 3 lives. But it was worth it. For day 45, I focused solely on crafting more teleporters in order to be able to move around the map faster and more precise. I don't want to bother you too much with the details of day 46, but let's just say it was a day of sacrificing. On day 47, I started off by gathering more performer thralls, as they would rid me of the corruption from performing an absurd amount of sacrifices. Speaking of sacrifices, I spent a few in-game hours doing just that. And finally, to end my 47th day, I went to most of my original teleporters and activated them. For day 48, I pretty much spent the entire day running between different teleporters I had placed across the map already, and just started activating them. Wow. Days 49 and 50. Halfway through the series at this point, I pretty much spent these 2 days placing and activating even more of my teleporters. This would provide me such an incredible teleporting network. Day 51, and I finally decided to make the upgrade from hardened steel tools and weapons to star metal. Now, star metal can only be harvested from these meteors which fall from the sky every few hours. In order to crack the meteors open, I used my explosive arrows, and the star metal inside would be revealed. I spent the entire day searching the north for these meteors. I was even able to see one of the meteor shower events, which is probably the coolest way I've ever gathered a resource. For day 52, I went to harvest brimstone in this location called the Shattered Springs. Now be warned, this area has toxic gas in the air, so in order to survive, I used my sandstorm mask. Anyways, after that short adventure, I came home and smelted star metal ingots. With all of these new ingots, I crafted a new set of tools and weapons. Then I crafted a new set of armor. The Aquilonian set really reminded me of a Spartan from ancient Greece, and honestly, it's one of my favorite looks. For day 53, I had done some research and learned that one of the best thralls you can get is the Relic Hunter Treasure Seeker, which can be found in the unnamed city. With that new discovery, I headed there and grabbed 2 of these Relic Hunters for myself, and these 2 followers would be my greatest allies. Day 54 is when I finally started to put more focus on defeating the bosses. So to start, I went to the Silver Mine once again and ventured in deep to find the ancient Scorpion Queen. With my newly crafted star metal javelins and the Relic Hunter at my side, we faced this foe. With our well-calculated dodges and my absolute tank of a thrall, things were looking good for us. And after a long and gruesome battle, we emerged from this cave victorious and well compensated for our efforts. I should mention, there was no real order to the way I was doing these caves and boss fights. I started by being lazy though, and by that, I mean I went after the ones closest to my base. Anyways, on day 55, I headed to Clail's stronghold. Now, some of you paying attention may remember that this is where I lost my first powerful thrall, Leon, and this is where my revenge would take place. My follower and I were greeted at the start by the Gate Guardian. Luckily, he was no match for the 2 of us. We wandered into another boss fight with the War Maker's adjutant, yet another foe that was not enough to bring us down. We then found ourselves in a swift battle with the Archivist's assistant, which the name now makes sense, as he was pretty weak and an easy fight to say the least. We made our way to yet another fight with the foe known as the Servant of the Priest King. I have to say, this Priest King kind of surrounded himself with weaklings. We came across the Arena Champion. This was the fight where Leon perished, and I vowed to avenge him. With Leon's death, I learned the Arena Champion's attack and knew exactly how to defeat her. You just knock her down repeatedly. That's pretty much her weakness. Anyways, with the champion's demise, I gave my follower a new name in honor of Leon, Bane of the Champion. This name became a true statement, as the next boss, the champion of the Warmaker, was quickly felled by his hand. Day 56 was another tragic day that I don't want to spoil yet again. However, what I can tell you is that I did lose my new follower to a boss known as Thag. I can tell you I narrowly escaped death, and with the loss of yet another friend, I would have my vengeance. Starting day 57, I brought a new follower with me to the south, to a place known as the Arena. Once inside the arena, we were faced with the first boss, a giant snake. He was much more formidable than most, and had the advantage of dealing a lingering poison effect to both of us. Nonetheless, we were able to overpower this giant serpent and bring about his defeat. While we were traversing this decrepit pit, I was gaining corruption, and because of this, my maximum health and stamina were being lowered. And of course, with only 50% of my health, we came upon the next boss, the Undead Dragon. This mighty beast, once slain by the champion Tyros, was a worthy foe. Because of his size, some of his attacks were slow and predictable, but he had enough health to compensate. But it was not enough to stop me. Even with his fiery breath and being capped at 50% of my health, I emerged victorious against this beast with my companion. While day 57 was filled with mighty foes, I can't say the same for day 58. I traveled to the north to a location known as the King's Barrow. Here I found the King beneath, and with only 4,000 health, he was no match for my follower, let alone the 2 of us. However, from him, I did acquire an item we would need later, the Diadem of the Giant Kings. Day 59. I traveled far to the northeast and found this creature called Feast on Flesh in a cave. My follower and I made quick work of this winged creature and continued our journey. Traveling down this mountain, we found another cave which held yet another one of these demonic children of Jill. Its name was the Nest Mother, and just like the last winged beast we faced, we defeated it fairly easily. Finally, we went to one last cave and found shrouded in darkness another child of Jill. This fight was a little more difficult, as this creature had a companion, but just as the others, with me focusing the companion and my follower on the boss, We were able to defeat them fairly quickly with minimal damage. I traveled here to the Black Keep for my 60th day. While this was one of the most impressive and incredible locations in this world, I could not be distracted, as the boss in this keep was the Kin Scourge. The Kin Scourge was once the half-human, half-giant son of the priest king, Tyros, the Deathbringer. Unfortunately, my companion and I were inevitably face to face with this fabled warrior, and defeated him rather easily. But as the champion who slayed the undead dragon, we still gave our respects. I have to say, Day 61 was probably one of the creepiest dungeons in this entire game. In the southwestern part of the map, there is this dungeon called the Dreg. Inside, as you progress through this dungeon, an eerily faint voice calls out in almost a whisper to you and draws you in like a siren. As I got closer, the voice began to sound slightly different and more menacing. Finally, we reached a large circular room where this monstrous beast stood tall. I let my follower take the lead and get the beast's attention. With its body exposed after attacking my follower, I landed several arrows to defeat this monstrosity. For Day 62, I headed to a familiar location. Here in Hanuman's Grotto, I returned to defeat the boss known as Valus the Loyal. Luckily for me, this boss had one weakness that I could exploit, just like the arena champion: knocking him down. I made short work of Valus, and then from him I gained a worthy tribute. Handing over this tribute, I was given a gray ape and gorilla to fight at my side. Day 63 and yet another boss fight. This one was in a place called the King's Niche. Yet another king, and he was called the Tortured King. Kind of a cool name for such a lackluster boss. He did take a couple of minutes to kill, as he did have 17,000 health, but he did not attack very much, and this would ultimately be his demise. Day 64 was pretty awesome. I went to the Child of Jabal Sag and bought a potion of midnight. Drinking this potion teleports you into a dungeon called the Midnight Grove. Once inside, I followed the path until I came upon the first boss. This boss was known as the Brother of the Night, but unfortunately, it only had 3,000 health. So my follower and I decimated him fairly quickly. Continuing forward, we stumbled across yet another boss. It was a giant silverback gorilla. While it did have more health than the panther boss previously, it was still not enough to slow me or my companion down. Luckily though, the next boss put up more of a fight than the others, and this one was a giant bull. While our melee weapons did little to this beast, I decided to let my follower tank its attacks while I shot arrows from a distance, which proved to be very effective. Coming to the end of the dungeon, we found ourselves in the presence of the Brother of Blood. It seemed to be a half-wolf, half-man combined. His attacks were fast and fierce, but eventually he fell to our blades just like the rest. And with this victory, Jabal Sag, the lord of this realm, deemed me a worthy challenger and named me a chosen of Jabal Sag. Traveling to the far east, I ventured into a palace. This palace had a very important foe inside of it. It was the palace of the Witch Queen. Getting closer to the queen herself, I was attacked by one of her massive guardians. My follower took most of the hits as I attacked one of its legs and brought it to a crumbling halt. But then as one was defeated, yet another attacked. As it did, we were also surrounded by some sort of beams of power all around the room. Having to dodge both the guardian's attacks and the beams was fairly annoying, but not impossible. And we defeated yet another one of the Queen's Guardians until she decided to come down from her throne and join the fight. Luckily, like any of the human bosses we fought so far, she had a weakness to exploit, knocking her down. She dropped two important items: the Mask of the Witch Queen, which would be important later on, and the key to Rasma's quarters. Now, I didn't know what the key went to at the time, but after reading the wiki, I wish I would have known, as the story is pretty interesting actually. After defeating the Witch Queen, I explored some of the nearby islands off of the coast. I discovered a boss on my journey and decided to fight it. It did have some pretty devastating attacks, and it was one of the ugliest creatures I've seen. But it did not prove to be a match for my companion or myself. Exploring more of the eastern part of the map, I came across a massive spider boss. It was a worthy foe with over 14,000 health, and just like all spiders, inflicted a lingering poison effect. I let my follower tank most of the damage, as she had over 6,000 health, which allowed me to attack the spider consistently without taking too much damage. And soon, it was defeated. Day 68 came with the most difficult boss fight I've done thus far. I traveled to the savannah, donning my Aquilonian armor, to face a beast far greater than most. This beast was the giant elephant known as Thunderfoot, with almost 25,000 health. Thunderfoot would prove to be the longest fight I've ever done. With this fight, I could not solely rely on my follower to take all of the damage, because the elephant's attacks had a large area of effect. But thanks to all of the potions I brought, and help from my follower, we were able to defeat this mighty beast. After defeating Thunderfoot, I came back to the savannah to defeat yet another mighty beast. This time I would be taking on another white tiger. It had over 20,000 health, and its attacks really packed a punch. On top of that, they added a bleeding effect that dealt lingering damage. I put my follower to the task of tanking most of the damage, but even then, this smart animal still targeted me and forced me to back off at times in order to heal. Eventually, we were able to fell this incredible creature, and with it, I acquired yet another legendary item. On day 70, I headed to the Death Whisperer ruins in order to find yet another boss. My follower and I entered this small room surrounded by enemies, where we also found the boss known as the Executioner. This skeleton creature was not too much of a problem on its own, but that was only after I cleared out the other enemies. Because of how easy this boss was, I allowed my follower to deal the finishing blow. For day 71, I went back to the unnamed city, searching for a beast called the Red Dragon. At almost 25,000 health, this mighty creature was more formidable than I anticipated. Luckily though, my follower had its attention, and it only focused on her. With its attention preoccupied, I was able to deal massive amounts of damage, while also being able to dodge most of its AoE attacks. Heading deeper into the unnamed city on day 72, I found this boss known as the Watcher. Dealing massive amount of damage with his hammer and having almost 15,000 health, he proved to be a worthy adversary. Once again, I tried to let my follower take most of the damage. This strategy worked to my advantage, as it usually does, and allowed me to deal enough damage to defeat the Watcher from behind. Scouring the unnamed city for more bosses, I came across this massive dragon known as the Red Mother. She was much larger and more fearsome than the other dragons, but to our advantage, she had less health, which allowed us to defeat her much quicker. For day 74, I searched an unknown area of the unnamed city that was called the Aviary. While exploring the Aviary, I came across an albino bat demon called Winged Death. After a few attacks from this demon, I understood how it had earned its name. It had a very unique attack where it would fly up and dive bomb into me and my follower. Even though this beast had 15,000 health, we were able to defeat it fairly quickly and easily. On the 75th day, I found yet another boss in the unnamed city, called the Commander. While he was surrounded by his soldiers, we defeated them first, then took him on. This made the battle much easier actually. With him focused on my follower, I attacked him unrelentingly in the back. After searching the unnamed city for another boss, I found a creature named the Brute. He was some sort of skeleton demon, but admittedly, he was fairly easy to defeat. Day 77, and for the 7th day in a row, I scoured the unnamed city for bosses. Luckily, I was able to find the Guardian of the Flame. Implementing incredible strategy, like letting my follower get beat up, I was able to stand behind the Guardian, dealing enough damage to defeat him. Heading back home on day 78, I came across this giant rhino. With less than 10,000 health, this animal was much more resilient than any I had anticipated. I tried to let my follower grab his attention, but the king rhino did not care for my strategies and attacked us both. In fact, he lowered my follower's health to half. This was an impressive creature, and this fight was long, but we eventually were able to defeat him. For day 79, I headed down south after fighting the king rhino and decided to test my new weapons and armor on a boss I had fought before. The giant crocodile was incredibly easy for my follower and I, especially with all of our new gear. On the 80th day, I traveled to the Circle of Swords. Here I would find an enormous creature called a rot branch. This was yet another beast with not a lot of health, yet was a difficult challenge. While it did not take long to defeat it, it had done a lot of damage to me and my follower. In fact, my follower managed to send it into the atmosphere with only 500 health remaining. With day 81 came some disappointment. I traveled to New Azagarth, a large city to the north. I was looking for a warrior human, but never got the spawn for this boss, even after clearing the entire city. So I decided to say that this mini-boss, as it is referred to on the wiki, was not worth my time. I mean, what kind of a warrior would run and hide in the face of a challenge? Well, not this one, I can tell you that. Going back to the eastern part of the map, I found this ugly creature called the reptilian monstrosity. Luckily, this creature had a bit more fight than beauty. Using a different combination of weapons than I normally use, I wailed on this beast with all of my strength and the help of my follower. Luckily, it was no match for either of us, and we defeated it quickly. While I was near the palace where I had defeated the Witch Queen, I found a small boat that took me to a new island. On this island, I found a boss called the Watcher Above. We dispatched this enemy and his comrades fairly easily and continued onward. While looking for the next enemies, a voice called out to me, telling me to jump. So intrigued by this, I followed into the water. Quickly realizing this was some sort of underwater civilization, I followed the structures and the guidance of this disembodied voice. I soon arrived at the next boss, the captain below. Luckily, this boss couldn't be knocked down, allowing us to stun him and deal a lot of damage to defeat him. Continuing my underwater journey, I found this ugly half-human, half-fish enemy. Fortunately for him, though, we were able to take him out fairly easily. Learning more of this society of fish people, we were soon faced with an even larger and uglier creature called a Daughter of Dagon. While it was stronger than the enemies we have faced so far, it fell to my arrows nonetheless. We then found a warrior of Dagon and felled him just as easily as the others. Diving even deeper into this city, we confronted the Ritual Keeper that was holding Dagon, the voice leading me here, trapped. Day 84 was another good day for revenge. I headed back to the city of Relic Hunters into the cellar dungeon. Then I headed for a beast called the Rotted Hulk. He was surrounded by enemies, so we dealt with them first, then focused on it. Once again though, this was a pretty easy boss for us. Our journey eventually brought us to this demon spider. While I could have skipped it as I have fought this enemy before, I decided for my old follower, Bane of the Champion, I would make all of them pay for that death. And with a quick battle, this demon spider truly did pay. Coming to the end of the dungeon, we found ourselves facing Thag. He was unlike any boss we had fought so far, summoning a massive amount of enemies to aid him and calling upon some sort of damaging gas attacks. He was a worthy opponent indeed. I did get worried once I saw my follower's health, but we eventually defeated Thag and all of his minions. I I just hope with this victory my old follower has found peace. On day 85, we traveled to one of the farthest points in the northwestern part of the map. This dungeon was called the Temple of Frost. It was home to several frost giants, including Hrungnir of the Frost. While fighting this final boss, a blizzard ensued. I'm not really sure if he called upon the blizzard with his axe, or if that was by coincidence. But either way, it was not enough to save him from our blades. But as it turned out, Hrungnir was not the final boss. There was yet another creature at the bottom of the Forge of Ymir. Following the path, I was able to find the beast. It was a white dragon, and like most dragons, it had almost 24,000 health and similar attack patterns. At first, the battle was going well for me, until the dragon stomped my follower into the ground and disappeared for the rest of the fight. So, it was up to me to defeat this mighty beast on my own. While it did take longer, the white dragon fell to my blade just like the others. And of course, after it was dead, my follower magically reappeared, thankfully. I traveled to a place called the Passage. I had learned there may be another boss here, so I went to investigate. After searching inside this massive cavern, I came across another Sand Reaper Hive Queen. This one was much weaker than the one I faced previously. But that did not stop this beast from getting several good hits on me, including hitting me in it with its poison spit, which lowered me down to almost 100 health. After allowing it to do some damage to me, I dealt some right back, and was able to defeat it fairly quickly. Near Rockfall Canyon, I found this Black Yeti monster. The Black Yeti had over 22,000 health, which was very impressive, but that was all it had going for it. Its attacks were very slow and kind of weak and somewhat lackluster. Even with the blizzard, this beast was no match for us, and we defeated it easily. For the first time in this series, I explored further into the volcano in order to get to this dungeon known as the Well of Skelos. Once inside the dungeon, I discovered this giant volcanic forge. Now at the time, I did not really know what it could do, but I would learn later on. Anyways, there was a boss waiting for me at the forge, and he did have several followers around him. Now these guys did some really good damage, but it wasn't enough to kill me. Following the path, I came across a boss called the Keeper of the Larder. He was fairly easy to defeat, but right after him, there was yet another boss called Yuxa of the Brood. Once again, kind of underwhelming for a fight, but we defeated him just the same. Traveling further into the Well of Skelos, I came upon a giant throne room. On the throne was the final boss, the Degenerate. He could summon a lot of phantom reinforcements, but they could be defeated in 1 to 2 hits. Finally, the shield protecting the boss fell, and before he could leave his throne, we decimated him. On his body, I found this item, the shining trapezohedron. Another item that would come into play later in this story. Day 89 was actually one of the most difficult boss fights I've done so far. Not too far from my base was a creature called Rockslide. He was a massive creature, and his attacks were devastating. He dropped my health several times until I decided to use a new strategy. Basically, I climbed this rock and shot him with a combination of explosive and ivory arrows, letting my follower take most of his hits. And it actually worked until he was defeated. At this point, on day 90, I had pretty much defeated all of the bosses that I could find. So I headed back to the volcanic forge inside of the Well of Skelos. This is when I learned about what it could really do. Basically, using a combination of obsidian and steel, I was able to craft composite obsidian ingots within this forge. With this new resource, I was able to craft obsidian tools. Day 91 was fairly laid back as I spent the entire day organizing my base and the storage room that I had built. For day 92, I had a plan to upgrade my base and build a secure perimeter around it. So in order to do that, I spent the entire day harvesting resources like stone, iron, coal, wood, etc. By day 93, I had plenty of resources to build a perimeter around my base to defend from the Purge. After spending all day building the perimeter, I decided to take a seat and look at my work. And damn was I proud. On the 94th day, I realized in order to defend my base from utter annihilation, I would need thralls to defend it, so I headed to the city nearby and targeted level 3 archers first to give range support to the warriors I would have on the ground. Day 95, I headed north to the Mounds of the Dead. This area provides a specific thrall with a 100% chance to spawn. These warriors were called Chimerian Berserkers, and they were apparently some of the best fighting thrall. So I dedicated this entire day to gathering about 20 of them. Now I realized on day 96, after gathering more than 40 new thralls, I would need to arm them with a decent armor and weapons. So I focused on gathering more resources like thick leather from the nearby rhinos to make some sort of heavy armor for the berserkers, and maybe something for the archers as well. Day 97 was somewhat of a logistical day. What I mean by that is, I changed all of my archers' behaviors to only use ranged attacks, and set their range to the max. I geared them up with dragonbone bows and arrows. For the berserkers, I crafted Vanir heavy armor with a few Chimerian chestplates, since I had the resources. And at the end of the day, I upgraded the main base to black ice structures, which look incredible. Wow, day 98 and 99. I decided to enable the Purge to last 2 days. First, I sent out my animals to defend the base, and they got kind of steamrolled. Later in the Purge though, several Daughters of Dagon spawned, and they all had 14,000 health, and managed to destroy my base's perimeter several times. With this many of them, they also managed to kill several of my berserkers. Eventually though, we prevailed against them. And by now it was day 99 and it was coming to an end. So I decided to really test my warriors. So to make it even more difficult, I spawned 4 dragons and led them to my base. While my health did drop very low at one point, we ended up prevailing against these incredible creatures as well. With minor casualties, the day was ours and the Purge was defeated. Wow, day 100. It was finally here. For this day, I had one goal. Up to this point, I had been collecting several items from certain bosses, and now, here on day 100, they were going to come into play. I have to say, this game has been so much fun to play for 100 days. This video did take a very long time, as each day in game was 1 hour in real life. That means I put in 100 hours into just the recording. But it was worth it. Anyways, proceeding further with my goal, I headed south to speak with Petruso, the Sandstorm Maniac. Here, he has an item for purchase called the Heart of the Sands. In order to purchase it, I used all of the items I had gathered from bosses, but this did not mark the end of my journey, just yet. There was still one last step. Here, on top of the Chaos Mouth, I found an altar. Before I went towards it, I had to say goodbye to my follower, who had been with me for a very long time, and who I just now realized never had a name, but that's okay. And then I also had to say goodbye to Roach, the horse I had since very early on in the series. Saying my final farewell, I went up to the altar and placed a few items inside of it. These items combined to make the keystone, and with it, I was able to finally remove this bracelet, keeping me trapped in these lands, and it allowed me to wander free as a true nomad.